Hello everyone. This next video is going to be about the causes and prevention of dogs running hot. And a disclaimer first, nothing I say is meant for illegal purposes. I'm not intending to advise anybody to do anything illegal. It's all history, past experience, information, past knowledge, opinion, stuff like that. So, you know, uh, there's two reasons basically why dogs run hot in a competition, and that's any kind of competition, even the legal sports of today. And it's either because they overheat, that's a simple one, or it's from fatigue. Now, dogs run hot in a hot atmosphere. As we all know, they don't have pores like people do. They sweat through their feet and their tongue, their breathing, you know. When they breathe, the CO2 that comes out, that's where most of their fat is released. So when you're exercising a dog, it's not really through the sweat as much as it is through their breathing that they release that fat, that fat is eradicated or done away with. That's the first thing. Um, so a hot atmosphere can do that. That's why I was talking about in a previous video about altitude and temperature, dogs changing from this place to that place, or fighting at a, at a competing at a higher elevation and all that. Where the important thing is not to have the animal, where all those adverse situations not affect the animal. That's the main reason why people get there at the last minute. What I mean at the last minute, generally a day before, 30 hours before the competition, something like that, so they can settle in, get their last feed, rest, relax. But they're also put in an environment where that outside temperature, that outside altitude doesn't affect them. And another reason for dogs running hot is that adrenaline dump. They get overexcited, they push themselves hard, dump all the adrenaline at one time rather than pacing themselves, and then it's hard for them to recoup from that. So stress is one of the reasons why dogs run hot in that environment. I'll give some examples. You know, the second part of that is the fatigue. They're not fit, they're not in good condition, they're carrying too much fat. Uh, you know, in hot weather, I would suggest that maybe you feed your dog less protein, right, because of that hot weather. And it, you know, I'll give a like I said, I'll give a couple examples. One would be mine. Some other examples I've seen. I went to a confirmation show in Mexico. One of the dogs there that was in the confirmation show. We went afterwards. Again, this was years ago. One of the dogs that was entered in that show, they were going to roll him later on. Now he was down in weight. He looked fit, but he was there all day, and he was not from that area. He's from out of the area. I'm assuming from where he was from, it was a cooler temperature for this reason. He was there all day long in the heat, and that heat started to affect him throughout the confirmation show that day. I've seen this in chickens too. Their tongue comes out, right? They stop breathing. They're panting because they're hot. And I've seen game fowl do that during hack fights, where when they get there, it might be a little bit cooler, but throughout the day, as it warms up, because they're outside, because it's warm that day, the chickens will start panting too. And I noticed with those, that are not kept maybe in a vehicle with the air conditioning on, or in a room where it's cooler, where the temperature is regulated inside a house, but they're outside, they're in that heat all day, and they start heating up. They never recuperate from that. They give a poor performance. So this dog, same thing happened to him. He was in the heat, he was out all day, you know, even though he was in the shade most of the time. When they bring him out, walk him out, he started panting, right? After the show, we go to the place to roll the dog, and there was a bunch of us in the vehicle, plus the dog in the back of the vehicle. No air conditioning, even though the windows were open. The sun was beating down on that back window where the dog was. And it wasn't a 5-minute ride. It was more like a 30, 40. We went back and forth and over this and that. By the time we got there, the dog had been in that vehicle for 30, 45 minutes. So we get him out. He's a little bit hot, still panting a little bit. His opponent for that role was from that area. He lived there. We went to that guy's house. He was heavy. That dog was heavy. So they go at it. But by the 15-minute mark, that dog who was at the show was so overheated that he couldn't hardly stand. And to his benefit, he did show gameness because he'd still scratch. He was all wobbly, almost falling down. Wasn't that rough of a roll. He didn't get hurt that much. He was just overheated to the point where he couldn't recuperate. So after they stopped it, they brought him outside and they had to run a hose on him, a water hose, for 10 or 15 minutes straight until he cooled down, until his body temperature cooled down. If they hadn't have done that, he might have died just from heat stroke, right? In my case, I had a female that I'd won best in show, and I put her through a keep. It was her second keep, and I put a harder keep on her. And this was in warmer weather. This was getting towards summertime. And I did more work on her, put her through a harder keep than I did the previous time. But at the end of the keep, I could tell I missed it. I missed her peak. It was too much, too long of a keep. So she peaked out. I tried to adjust, and she never did dry out properly. She never got to that point that I like my dogs dried out. So she was wet. Her skin just popped back. I did everything I could to the last few days to dry her out, but it just didn't work out that way. So during that show, she ran hot. She never recuperated, and she ended up losing. And like I mentioned before, other dogs, if they're done properly, they can go through all these adverse scenarios, situations, and it doesn't affect them. So one of the reasons, and you can go back and look at my video of peeking a dog out, why dogs run hot, what we call run hot, whether it's fatigue or whether it's overheating, is because you miss that peak. And I would put that more on the fatigue side, meaning, they didn't get enough rest, you missed the peak, they're sore, too much stress, not enough sleep maybe, also not just the stress, but the lack of nutrients can cause that. If they don't have enough vitamins and minerals, trace elements, macronutrients, or whatever they're called in them, the stress, those, because they don't have those nutrients, the stress makes them run hot. The stress makes them tired because they don't have enough to replenish after that stress, which, on the opposite side of that, if you're giving them a little bit too much of something, say protein or iron or B12 or something like that, the stress during the workout offsets that, brings it down. Whereas if you didn't do nothing to them, or didn't give them enough exercise and workout, those levels would still be too high. That's one way of doing it. The other, of course, is just don't give them as much. So those are two of the main things, why dogs run hot and why dogs get tired. You know, the general consensus for a dog's intake of protein and fat is generally like 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Here's where things can get a little off for people. So let's say it's normal for your dog in their feed to give them 1 gram of protein per pound of weight just in their daily feed. So now you're going to put them in a keep. How much do you increase that? If you're doubling it or tripling it, that may be too much. And it seems like a small amount, 1 ounce per pound. But over time and over the number of pounds, that would be 40 grams per day. So giving them 80 grams may be too much. The increase could be just maybe half a gram. 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. Same with the fat. The fat is a little different because fat is what they need for energy, right? So just a regular dog that doesn't do anything, they may need 5 to 10% of their nutrition intake be fat. That could be 15 grams, say, of fat per day. But because we're putting that stress on them, because they need more fat for energy, the variation in that is pretty broad, depending on the size of the dog, their metabolism, how much work you're putting on them, how much rest you're giving them. It could be 15% to 80%. It's a wide range because it all depends, unlike protein, it all depends on how much stress you're putting on the dog, how much workout you're giving the dog. So what people have a tendency to do, like I've mentioned, is give too much. If you give too much protein, a lot of times they can burn it off. But if they're not active, now you can have liver and kidney damage. That's why sometimes people you say, well, you give them too much protein, it hurts their kidneys. Not in that sense. If they have a kidney problem and you give them already, and you give them too much protein, it's going to damage their kidneys. But also, if you give them too much protein and they're not going through that stress to use up that protein in their workout, then you can have organ failure with that too, organ damage too. Iron is kind of a whole different trip. You can give, quote unquote, too much protein and it may or may not affect them. You can give them too much fat and it could affect them by them being too heavy. But if you give too much iron, now you're talking internal damage. So that's why some people, especially the people that use beef in keep, some give liver. If they do, they just give a little bit. Because liver has iron in it, it has B vitamin, has different nutrients in it. So they want that added benefit of the nutrients in liver included in their beef. Some don't use liver at all because they're feeding beef anyways, and they don't need that extra iron and nutrients from that. They may be getting it from somewhere else. You can get that in a balanced vitamin mineral supplement. Whereas with whole foods, you really have to take into account the weight of the food, how much you're giving, whether you're giving it the liver every day or once or twice a week, plus the moisture content, all that. with raw food, that's why you have to have a really balanced meal. There's different factors. Whereas with kibble, it's all measured out for you. And with kibble, I think one of the problems why these uh, kibbles are having so many recalls and causing deaths in dogs and all that stuff is the method that they're using to process it. It's the process. It's not so much the ingredients. If a food has bacteria in it, or it has salmonella in it, or E. coli, whether it's animal product or whether it's agriculture product, if it's not cooked to a certain temperature, then it's not going to kill that bacteria or those that E. coli and salmonella. I did a little bit of research before I looked at this, and the average kibble cooking temperature is 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That ain't enough. To kill a lot of that stuff, it has to be 160, 170, 180, something like that temperature. So if they're not cooking it, the product at that temperature, if they're not processing it at that higher temperature to kill the bacteria, that's why they have issues with the kibble. It's not so much that the food is tainted, because all food has all kinds of stuff in it, whether it's organic or processed or non-organic, whatever it is. It has those things in it, or it has a potential to have it. But if you're not killing it off through the cooking process, it's going to remain there. I can say that for myself. Went to a foreign country. I thought was salmonella. When I came back, my doctor told me wasn't salmonella. It was E. coli poisoning. And all it had to do, because I've been to that country several times, never had a problem, but all they would have to do was cook that meat at a higher temperature. That was basically the problem. I should have known, because the meat looked funny anyways, man. It wasn't even, looked white or something. Anyways, that's what I think the problem is with processed food, is the processing itself with kibble. It's not so much that the ingredients are bad, is that they're not processing it properly. So when you have dogs, when you see them and they're in their performance, getting back to the overheating and fatigue problem, is you have to kind of look at it like this. In the past, when we rode dogs, and you hear it all the time, we feed them their regular feed. The dogs are active all day or not, and you may give them regular exercise or not. And depending on the temperature when we rolled them, that was a factor. But if it was nice, cool weather and the dog was down in weight, you hear it all the time. We could roll our dogs for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, over an hour, up to 2 hours. And not saying that it didn't stress the dog out. They were hurt and fatigued and all that, but they weren't blowed out. They didn't. They survived afterwards. So how is it that we could do that with dogs, where the dog went through that, whether it was a game test or whether it was just a hard roll or whatever it was, survive that, give a good performance, and then you put dogs through a keep and they can't even go 30 minutes and they're hot. And we could use the excuse that maybe it's a higher elevation, or you're going from one temperature to the other temperature, or different times of the year, all that stuff. Well, I've seen dogs do that right at their house, 10 minutes from their house, blowed out after going through a keep. Nothing changed except for a 10-minute drive or a 15-minute drive. So the problem was in the keep. The problem was, like I mentioned, they're not fit. They're overweight. They're way too wet for the temperature. Too much protein in the heat. Not enough rest. They're fatigued. They miss their peak. Now, when I talk about missing their peak, It also involves this. You can have the dog go off his peak the day of that show, the day before that show. If they're not quiet and rested and left alone, if they're doing hoop-de-doos and running all day, if they're getting amped up when you take them out and they won't settle down and they burn themselves out and keep doing it over and over in a 24-hour or 48-hour period of time, their peak is gone. It's blowed out. It's used up. Just like traveling. I mentioned you can, good dogs travel, they're fine. If they don't travel properly during that travel, whenever it was you left and whenever it was you got there were adverse situations that the dog couldn't handle it, his peak is gone. But let's say there's not those adverse situations, everything went good, and the dog is just too wet, and the dog is just too heavy, or you didn't adjust for the temperature that you would be showing your dog at. You got there and he didn't have enough time to acclimate, and that affected him. Going back to that dog in the show. If he had not entered the show, not been out there all day, if he'd been in a room where it's nice and cool, and even though he got there that day and they rolled him in the evening, if he hadn't have gone through all that, driving around in the heat, stuffy, no ventilation, and they rolled him later on that night inside a building that was cooler, the heat probably wouldn't have bothered him. He wouldn't have overheated like that. But because he went through the situation that he did, the heat did bother them, even though he looked fit, even though he was down in weight. That's the adverse effects of heat, because, like I said, the dogs they don't cool down like we do. Plus, their temperature runs a little higher than humans, so it's already higher. And then you have the factor if he's a barnstormer type, or he doesn't know how to pace himself, he's going to blow out and run hot and not be able to recuperate. But if they are in good condition, even the barnstormer type, if you put that endurance in them, and they still have that rush where they come out 20, 30 minutes, go hard, they'll be able to recuperate on the fly in 1 or 2 or 5 minutes, whatever it is, because you put that endurance training into them, and get back up and continue forward. Or after resting on their feet, just kind of going through the motions, going along with it, come back and then pick up the pace again. So pinpointing what the problem is, if someone says, oh, you gave him too much iron, oh, you gave him too much protein, oh, he's too wet, oh, he's too heavy, oh, the altitude bothered him, the weather, it was cold where he was at, now he's in the heat, it was heat where he was at, now he's in the cold, he's lower elevation, now he's higher elevation, he was up higher elevation, lower elevation. It's one thing to say all this stuff and give these examples, but you should be able to pinpoint through experience, through over a period of time, what the problem was, and then eliminate it before it happens. So there's a process you go through when you're conditioning dogs, and your mind has to be like, whatever the situation is, my dog has to be able to handle it. I have to know how to go through that situation, do the things I need to do. If they're dehydrated, that can be a problem too. They can run hot because of that. So it may just be more than just giving them more water. You may have to IV them. You may have to give them electrolytes, Pedialyte or Gatorade or something like that to rehydrate. It isn't just so much about water a lot of times. They can drink a bunch of water, but if they're lacking the minerals that it takes to rehydrate, then they could still be a problem, even though you've given them enough, what you consider enough water. So that's part of it too. That's why I keep going back. Too wet is not good, too dry is not good. Both can cause the dog to do what we call overheat. Missing the peak can cause the dog to overheat. Improper nutrition, improper rest, sleep can cause the dog to overheat. And it's generally those two things: overheating, high temperature, or fatigue, not enough rest. That's why you can destroy that peak the last 2 days or the last day, even if they do not rest. So, hopefully, this answers some of the questions. And again, since this is such an important topic, someone with experience, different experiences, feel free to add in the comments. I'll address them. I try to answer every comment that's on there, even if it's a thank you or a thumbs up. But the more information we can put, in the comments of my videos, the more it will help others. And that's the reason for all these videos. One of the reasons is to help others. Give information, good solid information backed by experience. You can't fake it. So I don't know everything, but I can give my experiences, the positives and the negatives. And if you don't learn from your losses, if you don't learn from the negatives, then you're missing the whole point of learning, because those are generally the ones that teach you the most. So I hope you enjoyed the vid. Thanks for watching.